FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
We're back on the Financial Survival Network. This is Kerry Lutz. We've got John Rubino on with us of dollarcollapse.com. How are you, John?
Great, Kerry. How are you?
All right. So happy markets in an unhappy world. Your latest scribe here, your latest screed. And yeah, the world's falling apart, but the stock market seems not to take any notice of it and just keeps going up, right?
Yeah, it's a very scary world out there. Of course, it always is. There's always stuff going on out there that you can point to and say, whoa, that could spin out of control. But lately, more so than usual. In the Middle East, we've got the Palestinians shooting rockets at Israel, which has caused Israel to launch a full-scale invasion, which is killing a lot of people. We're seeing pictures every day of little kids being maimed or killed, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really just appalling what's happening without assigning blame to anybody here. It's just one of those messes in the world where everybody has a point, but nobody has a solution. And then just a few miles over, you've got ISIS, the Islamic State for Iraq and Syria, which is grinding towards Iraq's capital. It's completely possible that we'll have a fundamentalist takeover of Iraq, which means that they'll get a hold of the U.S. Embassy, which is really a small city. Billions and billions of dollars we put into building this basically a military base right in the middle of Iraq. And to have ISIS take that would lead the U.S. very possibly to respond in some kind of really ugly way. And that's out there. And then, Russia and Ukraine, where it looks like Russia gave the ethnic Russian rebels some anti-aircraft missiles, which they used to accidentally shoot down a civilian jetliner and killed a couple of hundred people. And people are talking about that as an Archduke Ferdinand moment. Yeah. Referring to the assassination of an Austrian Archduke in 1914 that started World War I, and all of the stuff is going on at the same time, which you would think would make people nervous about buying really volatile assets like equities, because you never know what's going to happen on Friday afternoon. You have a long position, you go away for the weekend, and then over the weekend, all kinds of things could happen. They could spike the price of oil or cause any other, any number of other kinds of geopolitical turmoil, which would make the stock market really volatile, to say the least, on Monday. Do you want to, can you relax over the weekend with that kind of position? Apparently, lots of people can. And at the same time, the latest numbers for world GDP growth have come out, and they've been revised downward dramatically. Economists now expect the global economy to grow at less than 2% this year, which is extremely slow when you consider you've got a lot of developing economies in the mix who typically grow a lot faster than the developed world. And so you've got slow growth, extreme geopolitical stress right now, and yet equities are hitting records in the U.S. and soaring in the emerging markets. So why is that? And probably it's because the major economies of the world continue to flood the system with cash that has to go somewhere. China has seen their debt as a percent of GDP grow from 147% to 251% since 2008. In other words, they're in the middle of a historic debt binge. And a lot of that borrowing goes for infrastructure, which pulls in raw materials from the rest of the world, which pumps up developing world economies. And so that's in part why we're seeing equity prices go up around the world, because the second biggest economy, China, is borrowing huge amounts of money. And that liquidity that is thus created has to go somewhere. So it's flowing into equities because nobody knows where else to put their money. Bonds are yielding next to nothing, and cash now is seen as trash by most investors, so they're putting the money into equities. And this, of course, won't end well, but It's anybody's guess where it does end if stocks are going up in these kind of circumstances.
Yeah, and wow, it's just remarkable. And gold is going down, so it all makes sense, I guess, huh?
Yeah, that's what's strange about this whole process, because you'd think gold would be the main beneficiary of geopolitical stress and extreme liquidity. That's the textbook definition of the environment for a gold bull market. And it's not happening. So, we can speculate, as we have here quite a bit, about the manipulation of this market. And it's looking more and more like that's the only explanation for the whole world not piling into gold in this kind of a stressful, hyper-liquid environment.
Yeah. And there is no other place to put your money. Look at what happened with the SEC putting limits on withdrawals of money market funds in the event of an emergency, right?
Yeah, that's another piece in the puzzle here, because basically they've been trying in various ways to funnel people into the riskiest possible assets, which are equities and junk bonds. And they did that originally by lowering interest rates down to zero, so you can't make any money on your savings. And now the people who do have money in money market funds are faced with a new law that allows the money market funds to restrict withdrawals. So you try to get your money out of a money market fund, which you think of as cash. To you, that's basically the next best thing to cash under the mattress. And now you can't get it out. So it's like having a bank account during a bank run, when they just close the doors and say you can't have your money. And money market funds now have the ability to do exactly that. So the idea is that people who have money in money market funds are going to now consider that a risky asset. And they're going to figure, well, stocks are risky too, but at least stocks are returning something. Maybe I can make money in the stock market. So they're going to move more money into equities. And that, in theory, is going to activate the wealth effect, through which people whose stocks are going up feel richer and decide to spend more, and then that'll pump up the economy. And this is all a fallacy. It's all a theory that in the end doesn't work, because it begins with the taking on of extremely large amounts of debt in order to get this thing going, or to lowering interest rates to the point where it distorts the financial markets in some other way. So you begin with something that causes dysfunction, and you hope it ends with economic growth, but it doesn't, because all the malinvestment that comes from extremely low interest rates and from excessive optimism due to high equity prices end up causing more trouble than the economic growth solves. And so you end up with a bigger and bigger problem as you try to do this. More and more debt, which causes you to have to do more and more extreme things in order to deal with the debt you've taken on in the past if you want to generate economic growth. And that's where we are now. We're doing crazy stuff. Zero interest rates, money market funds that don't have to give you the money back, and it goes on. And all of it is going to end up causing extreme crises at some point in the future. It's a case of the cure being worse than the disease, and it's just a question of when does the cure turn into the disease. It's coming, and there's no way to know when, but I think you can point to all kinds of things that could be the catalyst. And China is especially interesting now, because as their debt continues to increase, the things they're buying with that debt are less and less valuable. They're engaging in malinvestment on a vast, maybe unprecedented scale, or at least something that is comparable to the housing bubble in the U.S. in the middle of the last decade. And they are not a system that's ever had to deal with anything like that, because they're still, to an extent, command and control. They've got a Politburo who makes the main decisions for the economy. And so it's anybody's guess how they're going to deal with it when they have some big banks fail, or when some of their construction companies just go under and start pulling down all their suppliers. I don't know. We'll see. And when it happens, the people who are buying equities at these levels are probably going to regret their decision.
And, they said they were going to start allowing defaults. They allowed one. And then the next ones that were supposed to happen, all of a sudden, last minute bailouts taking place under the radar. But how long can they do that for, John?
Well, the bailouts cost money. So it's another form of malinvestment. They're going to borrow the money or print it and give it to, say, a construction company or a bank that's in trouble. Well, now you've got that debt to deal with. And you didn't really save anybody, because these companies are still dysfunctional. They still have a lot of assets that aren't really worth nearly as much as the debts that they've taken on. So We see this again and again. That's been the U.S. response to everything here. We're theoretically a free market country, but the minute any major player within the economy gets into trouble, we whip out the checkbook. We bail them out, we borrow the money that it takes to do that, and then we end up with more debt for the next crisis. And this has been going on for 30 years now, and ever since the tech bubble. And so the amount of debt that we have now to deal with almost guarantees that the next crisis is going to be bigger than the last one, which means our response is going to be even bigger, and so on. The next time around, if we have a financial crisis in which some big bank or insurance company gets into trouble, or there's some kind of geopolitical event that causes oil to spike or whatever, pick your favorite catalyst. It's not going to be several $1 trillion to fix it. It's going to be several tens of trillions of dollars. And we're going to have to come up with that money from somewhere. And we'll, try to borrow it. We'll definitely print a lot of it. And we'll take a lot of it from the existing wealth in the U.S. We'll do bank bail-ins, we'll do capital controls, we'll do wealth taxes, all of which will cause turmoil in the financial markets. So this next time could finally be the time that the financial markets just spin out of control, because there's too much debt to deal with, and people finally lose faith in the government's ability to just step in and fix things, and that's when the game ends. And again, we don't know when it's going to be, we don't know exactly the details, but it's virtually guaranteed by the amount of debt that we've taken on.
And let's talk more on this when we come back on the Financial Survival Network.
FSN Radio.
When your accountant wants tax-free income, this is what he does. Accountants know the law. They also know that any American could legally get paid up to 3 times per month, 100% tax-free. That's 36 tax-free checks each year. It doesn't matter what you make already. This simple strategy could work for anyone. Go to www.irsrevenge2.com to learn how. That's irsrevenge2.com.
The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
We are back on the Financial Survival Network with John Rubino. Yeah, John, right? You reach the Minsky moment. The debt's got to be done away with somehow. And generally, they don't have bankruptcy court for countries or for worlds. So, I keep getting back to the debt jubilee. There's no other way to do it here. And that's going to require dismantling of the too big to fail banks around the world. Because basically at this point, John, when you get down to it, every bank is really too big to fail because they're all interconnected. You can't have one bank fail without all the banks failing, or one bank of significant size, right?
Mm-hmm. No, that's, You can't even have a small crisis now without the risk that it turns into a bigger one. And that's just the nature of being over leveraged. You lose the flexibility that you used to have to deal with one thing and keep it from metastasizing to the rest of the economy. So that's where we are. And the question of how we deal with it is really the interesting thing. I think it's baked in the cake that something big is going to happen. But the whole debt jubilee idea, which is, we're really doing it on an ongoing basis. When you inflate away your currency, in effect, you're creating new currency and giving it to debtors as a way of alleviating their debt burden. And so you're basically forgiving their debts. So we're doing a debt jubilee on a rolling, slow motion basis, and it's not helping. Mm-hmm. So at some point, we might have to get explicit and say, all right, the Fed owns $7 trillion of government debt. We're just going to write it off. We created it, or, we bought it with fictitious newly created currency, which doesn't mean anything. So we'll just eat the loss, and evaporate the debt. But of course, the currency will still be out there. And I suspect that the markets will love it for a little while, and then they'll realize that this just opens the door to basically unlimited money printing, because now we've basically set the precedent of borrow as much as you want to, the government will bail you out if you get into trouble. That's the Greenspan put, which has been in place for the last 20 years, made explicit government policy on a vast scale around the world. And so then, who knows? Then the markets just go crazy, because you have a green light to borrow as much as you want to, invest it in anything you want to, roll the dice. And if it works, you get incredibly rich. If it doesn't work, the government bails you out. And
socialize the losses and privatize the profits. And there you have it, crony capitalism at its best. And And you had a great article reference, a link to it from Bloomberg. Skyscraper mania grips China as ambitions trump the economy, when you were talking about malinvestment here. And there's a city in China called Suzhou, and it's not even the biggest city in Jiangsu province, and it's joining the national rush for the sky with what's slated to become the world's third tallest building. And you look at the skyline of this city, and it's just striking, and it'll just be empty. More see-through skyscrapers in China, and it's just shocking here, all over the place.
Yeah, because in China, it isn't really market forces determining what goes where. It's local and regional leaders who are building little empires. They're borrowing huge amounts of money, and they're decreeing, okay, we're going to have a state-of-the-art airport here, and we'll put the world's biggest shopping mall over here and the world's tallest skyscraper. And they're just deciding that it would be cool to have these things, and just borrowing the money and giving it to construction companies to build it without any real regard for whether people actually want to use these things or will use them once they're built. And when things get built that way, obviously a lot of it doesn't work because there isn't stringent market research and growing demand behind it necessarily. And so, you got all these empty buildings and airports with no planes coming and going, and malls that are just empty. And those things don't generate any cash flow. So you got the debt that's still there that you took on to build, mini Manhattan in the middle of China, and the buildings aren't giving you back any money to pay off that debt. So what do? Well, we're going to find out what they do. They will go bankrupt in some cases. They will demand bailouts in other cases, and the Chinese government will have to sort it all out. And it's going to be messy, but the form of the mess is yet to be decided, because if they bail everybody out, that requires the creation of a huge amount of new currency. So you'll see the yuan fall dramatically in value. If they let defaults clear the debt, then you have the risk of those defaults spreading and even relatively healthy entities being wiped out by it. And then you fall into a 1930s style depression. Because remember, China has as much debt to GDP now as the US had in 1929. Mm-hmm. And so it's completely possible that the debt has the same effect on them now as it had on us in 1929. And we just don't know. We know there's huge malinvestment. We know China's the second biggest economy in the world, which means what happens there matters to everybody else. And we know they've got a crisis coming. So the form of the crisis is yet to be decided, because that's up to the guys in charge. What do they decide to do when the crisis hits? And because they're not free market guys, and they're inexperienced with this stuff. They haven't had to deal with crisis after crisis after crisis. We're at least experienced with that stuff. We have bailed out our banks and other countries and really the rest of the world 5 or 6 times in the last 20 years. And so we at least have the mechanisms in place to make our mistakes smoothly. And China does not have that. So.
Well, it's going to be real interesting because, in 1929, arguably, John, we really didn't know what the hell we were doing, didn't have a clue. Now, the mistakes that we're making, we really do know that we're making these mistakes, but, the people in power feel they have no other choice. China, is in a position to learn from history and has refused to learn. And therefore, they're going headlong into this thing. And the knowledge is out there, is my point. I'd argue that in 1929, the knowledge really wasn't out there to stop from making these mistakes.
Well, the problem with 1929 is that there's still a raging debate over the cause of the Depression,
I think it's a false debate. It's a false debate.
But see, the guys in charge are the ones who are wrong. In the U.S. I mean, the Keynesian, Keynesian analysis of the Depression was that we didn't liquefy the system quickly enough. They ignore the fact that we build up huge amounts of debt and huge amounts of malinvestment in the 1920s. And they look strictly at what happened in the 1930s, as if the lead up to it, all that borrowing, had nothing to do with the crisis of the 1930s. They say, well, capitalism is inherently unstable, therefore the government has to expand and liquefy the system. It's got to print more money when the time comes and encourage more debt. And in that way, you stop a depression or a crash from becoming a depression. And that analysis is what's being applied to today's world. So anytime there's a little bit of trouble, instead of allowing the bad debt in whatever niche is getting into trouble to be liquidated and to clear the system and let it start over, we respond with more and more debt and more currency creation. And so each cycle gets bigger and bigger because there's more and more debt to deal with. And so we're getting the result of a false analysis of the Depression playing out now in the U.S. and the global economy. Whereas if the Austrian analysis of the Depression is that, well, we created way too much currency during World War I, and then we went back on the gold standard at the old ratio of dollar and
$20 an ounce.
Yeah, and so that inevitably caused a huge inflation in the 1920s and a debt binge, which was inevitably going to cause a crash, which had to be worked off. So we made mistakes which are understandable in terms of the balance sheet of the country.
Yeah. And
had we not over-leveraged our balance sheet, we wouldn't have had the Depression in the first place. And so the way to avoid depressions is not let the debt binge happen in the first place, which is inevitably going to cause a depression. Because, we haven't fixed anything. We haven't actually avoided a depression here. We've just delayed it.
Yeah.
And created an even bigger crisis out there somewhere in the future by borrowing all this new money. And so we're going to find out at some point that the Keynesian interpretation of the Depression is not the appropriate model going forward.
Hey,
and that it just,
and the other thing is that there's never been in the mainstream a critical analysis of the failures of FDR. He's still a hero, right? Isn't that really the problem? Because all of his policies are failures. Mm-hmm. You go back to Secretary of Treasury Morgenthau's statement. I'm not going to say it exactly because I don't remember, but an approximate quote was, "Never before have we spent more, borrowed more, and accomplished less." In 1939, unemployment was still through the roof. The economy was still in the doldrums. Nothing had changed from all of those alphabet soup agencies, the WPA, all that stuff. And yet FDR is credited with ending the Depression, and nothing could be further from the truth. All of the programs failed.
Yeah. FDR was in a tough spot because he inherited an intractable problem.
Yeah.
And, we'd already borrowed way too much money in the 1920s. And so anything he did was going to lead to a period of extreme hardship. He could have gone right off the gold standard and just inflated his way out of it and encouraged people to take on more debt and created huge amounts of new currency. And we would have gotten out of the Depression in the short run. By 1933, we'd have been growing again, but we wouldn't have wiped out all the debt that needed to be wiped out. So we'd be kind of like we are now. We would be even more indebted than we were in 1929 and having trouble growing. We would be growing slowly, but we would be still living under the weight of all the debt that was taken on in 1929, plus all the new debt was taken on to get us out from the effects of the 1929 stock market crash. And so by 1945 or whatever, sometime in the future, we would have had a crash that would have made the Depression look like the good old days.
Yeah.
And so those were really his choices. He could have, if he had omniscience, total hindsight, he could have gotten us out of that depression by 1933, but it would have been at the cost of something even worse out there in the future. And so today we've made that decision. We decided to avoid a global crash in 2009, 2010, but at the cost of taking on absolutely insane amounts of new debt. The whole world has just leveraged itself to the hilt. China borrowed $15 trillion from 2008 to 2013. And that was really the engine. We didn't realize it at the time, only in retrospect, but that was the engine that pulled the global economy out of the Great Recession. But of course, that leaves China with more debt to GDP than the U.S. had in 1929. The U.S. doubled its national debt, or the government's debt in that same period. And so that leaves us incredibly highly leveraged now and unable to handle higher interest rates. So we have to keep interest rates low forever. That's our situation now, because the minute we let interest rates rise, all the world's governments, along with a big part of the leveraged speculating community, will see their interest costs go through the roof because they have to roll their debt over at higher and higher rates. And so they'll see this this rising curve of interest costs, which blow out their budgets and
everything.
Make deficits. Yeah. And
it all the way.
Japan and Europe and the US and now China are all in the same boat where we can't raise raise interest rates, no matter what's happening in the rest of the economy. If there's inflation out there, if prices start to rise, if we have asset bubbles, which we do now, we cannot raise interest rates to deal with them because that will blow out everybody's budget. So who knows how they deal with that at that point, because the solutions all seem to be pretty catastrophic. If you just continue to print money as far as the eye can see, then everybody will figure that out and nobody will want to hold currency. If you do let interest rates rise, and bite the bullet, then every major government in the world begins to go bankrupt. Or we have, like you said, Kerry, the debt jubilee, where they just write off all this debt. and then, you send a message to borrowers to just go for it. Borrow anything you want to. And
for anything.
Yeah, roll the dice. The whole world realizes that rolling the dice is the rational move. And
nothing is looking good here. So, hey, on that note, we got to go till next week, John, and go to John's site at dollarcollapse.com. Buy his book that he co-authored with James Turk of goldmoney.com, The Money Bubble, and go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com, sign up for a newsletter, get the first 5 chapters of Forget Wall Street, Go for the Gold and Silver 2 complimentary. John, we'll talk to you next week.
Great, Kerry. Talk to you next week.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.